Well, thank you so much for inviting me. This has been a wonderful conference, and I'm very honored. People have been so hospitable and welcoming. One of the wonderful things about being invited is everyone takes care of you, so I've been living like a queen. Especially Svezana has been just really taking care of me. Of course, one of the horrible things is to hear this kind of introduction that I can never live up to. I appreciate you all coming this morning. If you're like me, you have been living the good life here in Rijeka and burning a candle at both ends, enjoying the conference during the day, and great food and wine at night, and maybe some dancing. So I very much appreciate you coming. I hope my talk is coherent. I have been trying to decide what I wanted to say and what I thought you should know. And since one of the things I really like about this meeting is bringing together different people who are working on multilingualism and linguistic diversity from different standpoints, I'm going to sort of give you my view from the trenches. From the field, I am a field worker, and so I sort of see what's happening on people's hides, and I'm deep in this endangered language world, as Svezana said, and some of the people who are here are not. They're working in the lab, and I really hope that we can bring our different views and approaches together to look at what's going on. So I hope this is coherent, because I too have been enjoying the good life here. So we'll see. My argument at some level is very, very simple, and I'm going to be asking more questions than I'm answering. One thing I would like to do with this talk, and I hope that we can continue the conversation, is setting a research agenda. So you'll see questions embedded throughout, and if I move at a good clip, we'll get to them at the end. But basically, endangered languages mean that in sheer numerical terms, there's fewer languages. This language shift is resulting in greatly diminished genealogical and typological diversity and massive shift to a relatively small number of languages. We know that sustained contact does not necessarily mean shift, and we can have structural convergence, as in the Balkans. That's the classic case. I'm sure everyone in this room knows. But we have a lot of contact with shift, so one question is, are there linguistic differences between convergence with and without shift? And it's really catching the shift in process, if we can even answer that question. And then a question that I want to ask, and this seems kind of weird, but I'll get back to it, is about language revitalization. Does language revitalization increase diversity, or does it in some funny way decrease it? So this goes beyond counting as making diversity, but do we get what kind of typological structures emerge from revitalization and resuscitation? So resuscitation or awaking sleeping languages that haven't been used for decades, generations. So I'll get back to this and talk about it in a little more depth. And we've been talking about multilingualism and over the last, during the pre-conference and yesterday, and slicing and dicing it. But typically, we want to distinguish between societal multilingualism, where individuals speak a different language, but they're in the same space, and individual multilingualism, which the Council of Europe calls plurilingualism, where an individual speaks more than one language. These are not static levels of multilingualism. Even for the individual, change. They change over the course of your lifetime, and if you are multilingual, you may be using different languages differently on different days. So that's one of the problems, is that this is a moving, dynamic concept, and we treat it as static because I don't think we know how else to work with it, but we really have to start thinking about it as dynamic. And then another thing that's not usually talked about, but in particular the indigenous peoples I work with, really think about multilingualism in the household. And you see this, people are nodding their heads, the field workers are nodding their heads. You see one parent speaks 2 languages, another parent speaks only one of them. The children may learn something else in school, they may learn something else playing with children. So a lot of what's going on in the household and with family language planning or lack of family language planning, that's one sort of center of multilingualism that we really need to be studying more. And we don't, as far as I know, have any really good sense of how that household multilingualism maps out into larger society. And then we want to think about additive multilingualism and subtractive multilingualism, as they're sometimes defined. So additive multilingualism, a language is added to the repertoire of a speaker, and this happens. I was raised in a monolingual English-speaking home for generations, and one of those kinds of Americans. And so every language that I've learned in school or in the field. I'm very typical. Subtractive, where a new language is learned and replaces the first language. So this is shift, but typically immigrants, indigenous, minority populations, depending on what label you want to use, they give up the language. That's language shift. So in case some of these numbers are going to be well known to everyone, but some of you may not be thinking about them all the time the way I am. So the estimates are 50 to 90% of the world's languages are going to be lost. We don't know. Major cause, of course, is language shift. That's subtractive multilingualism. Not so much natural disaster, warfare, genocide, although we do see that. Typical sign of language endangerment is when the children stop learning and using the language, so there's a lack of intergenerational transmission. You may not get too hung up on some of the terminology, because clearly children not only learn languages fluently from their parents, but also on the playground from their peers. But there's a lack, regardless of where the input's coming from. If those kids aren't learning the language, then we'll say it's endangered. And so what we are really facing right now is rapid language shift. How many languages? I don't know. This is one map showing, I'm putting at 6,500. If you look at the ethnologue, 7,097 as of yesterday. I checked because this number is generally going up, and I don't need to tell people in Croatia how the line between a language and a dialect is really political. So who really knows? But it's a fairly large number, and we know it's decreasing, and that a very small number of languages are spoken by the world's population. So, you can just look at this. Despite the counting problem, who knows what the exact number is, but the overall trend is really, really clear. So, I think we have to look at this. The top 10 languages in terms of L1 speakers, of course the data here are lousy. We all know that. They're self-identifying as L1 speakers, but again, the trends are pretty remarkable. Well, you can see, there it is. So if we look at this in terms of millions, Mandarin is the top, English is third, and I do give sort of general public talks on language endangerment a fair amount, so every time I do it, I try to update these figures. And so I can tell you quite firmly, Punjabi's on the rise, it's been moving up. Bengali's on the rise, it's been moving up. Russian's moving down. So you'll see a lot of Russians are worried about their language being endangered. It's a big topic in Russia. Yeah, it's not really it's not imminent endangerment. And the red languages here, this is what I mean about diminishing diversity. We're already there. Those red languages are Indo-European. Then the ethnologue also gives numbers of L2 speakers. Now, I don't know who these L2 speakers are. It does not necessarily mean that this is their second language, but rather that they self-identify as proficient in this language to some degree. So there could be, you could easily imagine a speaker who knows some English and some Mandarin, but is a fluent speaker of Japanese, right? There's got to be, and I'm not sure how these are counted, but the trends, the numbers are really startling. And so if you look at this, again, you'll see, first of all, Indo-European's a big winner. And you can see that the languages where we have lots of L2 speakers are big colonizers historically and today. You could argue, coming from the States, I have to feel like a colonizer today. The Spanish, you can, Spanish is on the, Spanish, you know what? Sorry about that. Spanish is not number 2 and 9. That's a cut and paste problem. It's number 2 L1 speakers, so that's just ignore that line of Spanish. You can also tell that some of them, Hindustani, have to do with birth rate, right? So birth rate and power. If we look at the top 15 languages, we'll see where Spanish is. Yes, Spanish is in the right place. Okay, if you look in terms of the top 15 languages in terms of total speakers, again, we don't know what this means. Those L2 speakers of English, maybe they speak enough English to serve you a cup of coffee in Zagreb. Maybe they speak enough English to be like Sviestin and teach at NYU and pass as native, right? So we don't know, but notice where English is here, even ahead of Mandarin. So if you look back, it's kind of interesting, actually, because Mandarin, we think of Mandarin as being super big. It's 5th in terms of L2 speakers. Of course, if you put all Han varieties together, then you're sort of off the charts. And I didn't do that because that's not what I wanted to talk about. But anyways, so we look at this and there's a huge difference between the total number of people who declare English and Mandarin as having some access to it versus Hindustani, which of course is low prestige. And this also looks different, of course, if you separate Hindustani out. And you'll notice that there's a big cutoff here after Persian. Swahili then comes in. So it's really kind of interesting, and as I was putting these numbers together for you, I thought we could really stop here and have a really interesting conversation for the rest of my time. I didn't do that, but we sort of know this, but there's some things we don't know. We don't really know what's going on with those speakers. So one of the things I think we want to think about is how multilingualism has changed today versus historically. Pick some earlier period. First of all, multilingualism is global in several different ways, but it's no longer limited to geographically close languages like the Balkans. We're here. We are all multilingual. I'm assuming there's no absolute monolingual speakers of English. It's no longer associated with specific groups. It spreads across society. Modern migrations, I haven't got data on this, but it feels like, and certainly this is something that's happening, bothering Europe, the massive influx of refugees. Of course, there's always been migrations, but they're happening more rapidly, and the global population is higher, so we're seeing this impact. We see this in the US, where we are trying to build walls around the country. And then multilingualism is no longer limited to face-to-face interaction, in-person communication. We can do this all the time, instantly. So the internet has really changed this. We know that, in particular, young people are using social media. Many field workers find that it's easiest to connect with the people in their communities via Facebook. Cell phones. I can call anyone pretty much in the world now. Even where there's not a good internet connection, people tend to have cell phones. I mean, of course, there's exceptions. So one thing that I think we want to think about as research questions, even if you don't care about endangered languages so much, is what's going on when we now have an obvious global language? What are the impacts of having so many more L2 speakers of English than L1 speakers? Does the size of the population matter? Is there some sort of tipping point? The ratio of L1 to L2, levels of frequency and contact. So I've repeated the numbers here, so you just see that there's about twice as many, according to this count. I mean, who knows? But it's certainly the case as I travel. When I traveled 20 years ago, I needed often to speak the local language, and now I really don't. So I've put in, I'm keeping track of questions here, but I put in a couple of research challenges, which aren't really questions, and I'm doing this in part in case I forget to talk about them. But I said this, we need to understand multilingual practices, and we really want to think about language as practice. And that's one of the things that will tell us how the impact of English as a global language and the impact on language vitality. So one question is, who are all these speakers?
and what is a first language in the context of multilingualism today. So sort of as operationally, we'll say if you are a German speaker in Germany and you learn English, but German's your L1, then English is your L2. One of the things that we can talk about are heritage languages. So if you have second-generation Swedish immigrants in the US, I deliberately picked Swedish because they tend to not learn so much. Second-generation Spanish speakers may know more Spanish, but Swedish no. Swedish might be the heritage language. I've looked somewhat at heritage Polish. I've had students researching heritage Polish in Chicago. Chicago has the second largest population of Poles outside of Warsaw, so it's number 2 in terms of Polish population, but it's a lot of heritage speakers. So those kids acquire English with native proficiency and then Swedish or Polish without native proficiency. And then it's important to keep in mind that in the context of language endangerment, you can have Navajo community members. Navajo is a big group. Anywhere, you can find community members who learn English in the US as their first language. Navajo is their ancestral language, and they may have an emotional attachment to it, but they may not be able to speak it at all. They still see themselves as Navajo, and that's one of the things, of course, that tweaks census data, because sometimes ethnic people will declare their language to be their ethnic language to be, or their ancestral language to be their first language. In lots of parts of Africa, if you ask what's your mother tongue, they will give you the language that their mother speaks, and they think they must by birth speak fluently, even if they don't. So it's really hard to get at that. So I want to talk a little bit about speakers, and people have been asking me what Greenland looks like. So here's a picture of Greenland. Can't tell how good it looks on the screen, but this is the capital of Greenland that has a population of 17,000. The country has a total population of 57,000, and that's what a beach looks like in July in Greenland. so people want to see that. But what's very cool about this is we have Dudu, the baby. We have her mom. This is a neighbor. It's not the grandma, but we have 3 generations. These are her grandchildren. And we have me. And I'm the only one who's not a fluent speaker of Kalaallisut. So that's pretty cool in Greenland, and that's not what we find elsewhere. So one of the things that we need to talk about language endangerment is who the speakers are. Campbell and Munsell composed a speaker proficiency continuum, which is something that we need as we're talking about language vitality. You may not like some of these labels. I took their labels. The labels are shifting for political reasons. But this is sort of a starting point. So a fluent speaker has native full proficiency. A strong speaker, nearly fully competent. Imperfect speakers are reasonably fluent semi-speakers. Weak semi-speakers have more restricted speaking competence. And rememberers, according to Campbell and Munsell, know only a few words or isolated phrases. Now, Zasa expanded that notion of a semi-speaker, and this is useful, I think, at least as a diagnostic, maybe. So we really need to work on this. But he expanded semi-speakers, and semi-speakers is a very politically incorrect word in North America right now, but I'm still using it because they did. So he expanded it to rusty speakers, and these speakers develop from fully fluent speakers. They have comparatively good grammatical proficiency. Zasa said perfect passive knowledge, but memory gaps. And so they were once fluent, and then through lack of use, they get rusty. So this would be language attrition. They are often called attriters, but rusty sounds pretty good too. He distinguishes them from semi-speakers proper, who are characterized by incomplete learning. From the very outset, they have an imperfect command of the language, and they never get there. So those would be the heritage speakers, possibly, that we looked at. They aren't normally called heritage speakers within endangered language fieldwork. So one question is, why is there really any difference? I don't know the answer to it. I would not see any reason to
Would be, except that one of the things about the heritage speakers that differs from these semi-speakers is heritage speakers are typically in immigrant communities, no longer in the social setting where the language is spoken, and the semi-speakers are in that setting. They just may not have a larger community to turn to. And then I included here new speakers, which is a term that's used more within Europe and in some European context. It's not taken on quite so much in the US yet, but these are speakers who acquire the language outside of the home, usually in the education system or semi-formal setting. And one of the real things that distinguishes them from ZAS's semi-speakers is they are trying to learn and use the language. They are the revitalizers. So, just some questions. And I don't have good answers. You may, about your community, but cross-linguistically we don't have good answers. Are there synchronic differences in the speech of semi-speakers and rusty speakers? If ZAS is right and the rusty speakers fully acquire the grammar, there might be. But I don't really know, and on the ground, I don't know how to say, were you once a fluent speaker? Because people are self-identifying, either they self-identify as good or bad speakers, right? I don't know. I mean, they don't know if they spoke fluently at 12. Maybe their mother does, but you've all met mothers. Some of you probably are mothers. You tend to say really positive things, overly positive or overly negative things about your children, right? So we don't have, it would be really nice to know and find some diagnostics. Because for a field worker, if you're working to get grammaticality judgments, you would really care if the speaker once had the system or not. Presumably, we can reactivate those rusty speakers by using it, and also field workers working in endangered language communities will tell you that the more they start working through the language, the more that people start remembering. And if you put two rusty speakers together, they start remembering more and more, and if they're together, working together long enough, sometimes you can get conversations. It's hard to do with the semi-speakers. So that's sort of a diagnostic. But we just need better tools to measure proficiency. A lot of the proficiency tests are based on major European languages, presupposed literacy. So we just need that. That's my second research challenge. The new speakers, as I said, acquire this language often outside of the home in a formal setting. And this is coming with a large cross network. Some of you may know about it, be involved in it. How does their speech differ from traditional speech? And is there a difference between the speech of these new speakers and heritage speakers? There's certainly different kinds of social conditions going on. They are motivated to learn the language and use it. And that's basically my question here. How does this social status, does it have linguistic consequences? So let's look at one case. This is my favorite example because I love this guy. He's my hero, Darrell Baldwin. The Miami people were forced from their land in Indiana. There were forced marches. Many of them died. The last fluent speaker died in the 1960s, and Darrell Baldwin decided to reclaim his language. And he found some papers from his grandfather in Miami, and so he set about resuscitating Miami. Have you heard of him? He's a really marvelous man. So there's no dictionaries, no textbooks, no sound recordings, nothing. He's got stuff from his grandfather. He met a Berkeley linguist, graduate student, who was doing archival work and found some records, and Darrell decided that he needed to get an MA in linguistics so he could deal with this, and here he is teaching Miami. And so today, there's about 500 people using the language at some level. Darrell is such an enthusiast, he had to create a spoken language from these materials, working with David Costin. He's married a woman who's an equal enthusiast. She's white, she's not Miami. They speak to one another in Miami. I've heard it. You sit with them at the dinner table, and they switch to Miami when they're talking between one another. They made this commitment. They raised their children speaking Miami. The Miami tribe has a casino, and so they have some money. They've invested in the Miami Center. and language training. So this is clearly a very strong goal. And so people are using the language. It's unbelievable, right? It's absolutely unbelievable. What's that language, though? Isn't that an interesting question? And to reconstruct it from the historical records, took things from the sister languages to try and figure out how you should speak it. It's clearly not the language that they would be speaking if there had been uninterrupted transmission. You don't speak the language of your great-grandparents. It's changed. But this is clearly different. But what is it? And how much English interference is there? I mean, here you have two people who created the language, learned it. Daryl and his wife, I don't know how much she actually created it. They decided to speak it all the time. It's amazing. Well, what are they speaking? I think linguistically there's no way there's not interference from English, right? So what is it? It's really an interesting question. So this is it. Question 6. How does it differ? And this, of course, is a really sensitive question, right? You don't want to say that's not real Miami. And this is the cost network that's looking at new speakers. So this is the speakers are faced with issues of authenticity all the time, and they themselves feel it. So what's that language like? It's a really interesting research question. So I want to move a little bit into some data. And I'm really asking questions about the mechanisms of shift. People are studying borrowing. There's been a lot of studying. We know Matras and Sokol have identified borrowing hierarchies. Is there a loss hierarchy? Are some things lost first? One hypothesis for language attrition, for people who were fluent, is that they lose the last thing learned first, right? There's lots of ways we can test this now if we can figure out who was really a rusty speaker. Can we identify stages in language shift? Are there certain things we just don't really have that kind of data? Does shift those semi-speakers, does it differ from attrition? So one thing that has been looked at is negative borrowing. Basically, the idea is that if you have two languages, features that are not shared by both languages are most likely to be lost. And in the context of language shift, we would have social factors here. So the dominant language, the features of the dominant language would push out the features in the receding language more quickly. One of the problems, and it's an eternal problem in language contact, is we don't know what's due to language internal change, and there's really no good way to test that. If the language were left on its own, would it lose these features? Nancy Dorian in 2006 pulled together data from the 1970s, and this is a great article because there's a lot of hardcore data in there that will make those of you who are on the sciencey end of linguistics happy. But she compared two Scott Gaelic features with English parallels and two without at a point when Scots Gaelic is receding. And both of the features show change in progress. But she found only very modest support. Statistically, she's got a large enough database to do some statistics. So we don't know. So that's one hypothesis. So I'm going to give you some data now. As linguists, I thought you might want to wake up with that. Maybe you don't. We're going to look at areas where I've been working, and I am working, and we're looking at two languages here. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about Evenki, which is this dark brown area here. They're widespread. There's about 4,800 speakers at very most. We have a couple of examples from Itelmen, which is over here and is not related. So Evenki is Tungusic, Altaic, and Itelmen is Chukotka-Kamchatkan, which is spoken along here with the largest speaker population right now of that family being Chukchi, and it's about 4,500 maybe. And Itelmen, 3 speakers. So one model that I have been looking at that might explain change is a usage-based model, which looks at typological and social factors, views language as socially embedded and constantly evolving, and you've heard me speak enough to know that that's how I view language. The speakers are multiple agents in different situations, and sees language as interactionally and functionally based. One of the things is that usage and frequency are seen to be be important factors in language change, and surely that must be the case. That seems to be a no-brainer. Measuring it is another challenge, especially with the populations that I'm working with. So when I'm looking at contact with Russian and whatever language, language X, we have very small databases. We just don't have very much at all. We mostly do not have any conversational data whatsoever. The more historical data tends to be purified. The linguist collecting it got rid of any Russian borrowings, any code switching, and they normalized it according to the standard language that was defined by the Soviets as being the standard variety at that time. Also, the Soviet data includes fabricated and very unnatural sentences. It's breathtaking. So I've gone through a reference grammar of Evenki and used sentences in there as my model to test and then try to do things with different. I have not gotten a single sentence from that grammar accepted by any speaker. They either say, we don't talk like this, or it's funny, say, what are you trying to say? And some of them are obviously dumb. They're talking about Lenin or Stalin or, whatever. But some of them look like good sentences, but they are across the board rejected. Then there's also one of the problems dealing with these kinds of languages in the documentation is there's very little consistency across databases. So one of the things we need to look at is cross-linguistically. And I think Russian's great in the sense, this isn't politically correct, but it's great because it's one language killing all these other languages, right? So at least we have one language moving forward and we at least know about Russian history. But it's really hard. There's a huge lack of longitudinal data and most of the historical stuff has very little information about the users. Even today, we don't have good information about their users, their levels of multilingualism when they're multilingual. So I'm going to look at one construction because I wanted to give you some data, and I'm going to look at the nada construction. Nada means necessary, it is necessary, and it has spread throughout the Russian Federation like wildfire. I think it's a possible pathway for a new grammatical construction, so we're going to look at it in Evenki. And what you need to know about Evenki is its head final and agglutinating. The rest of it I've told you. So here's the construction, and it's a very widespread one in Russian. So you have a dative experiencer, меня, you get nada, and then you add an infinitive. So I need to do renovations. Мне надо сделать ремонт. And if you want to put it in the past tense, there is no agreement there's no grammatical subject, so you use the neuter singular. There's no verb to be, overt verb to be in the present tense. This should be very reminiscent to Croatian, and this is exactly the same construction, right? Мне холодно, хладно мне. The benefit here is we have Croatian retained the verb to be, but the marking is the same. And this construction is really widespread in Russian. You can do all kinds of things with it, and it gives syntacticians lots to talk about, but it happens. So I think it was borrowed, nada was borrowed for a number of reasons. One is it's frozen. You can borrow it, it doesn't take any morphology, it's easy. Phonetically, it's also easy, right? Nada. It is one of the most frequent words in Russian. It's ranks 91. And everybody I've worked with in the field agrees there's a social factor. The Russian bosses or the Soviet bosses are saying nada, nada, nada. And I can tell you anecdotally, my children were from very early on, from 6 months on, in and out of Russia and spent time there. One of the first words they would learn was nada, right? They hear it, nada. Nada and ni nada. That's don't, right? Ni nada, ni nada. I mean, even my daughter, when she started taking Russian again in college, I said, do you remember anything from when you were a kid? She said, yeah. She said, what? I remember ni nada. Why would you remember that? I said, well, you heard that one a lot. So anyways, Evenki is described as having 2 deontic modal suffixes, nyat and machin. The distribution depends on the dialects. If you remember that picture, they're really widespread in Siberia. So nyat is used in the eastern dialects, closer to, sort of toward Japan, and machin supposedly in the western dialects, closer to Moscow. The western dialects are moribund. But the bottom line, if you have a sample sentence, and here's that grammar I was complaining about, Konstantinova, you would think you would get this right? So in Russian, я должен вам рассказать. I'm anticipating this. I can't get a speaker to tell me that. This is where I get, what do you want to say? And so if I say, tell me how I can say, please translate from Russian. Я должен вам рассказать. I get B, Sindu, Ulugученов, Nada. It's really striking. This is a complete calc, a complete replication, pattern borrowing from Russian, and here we have a purposive converb. There is no grammatical infinitive in Evenki. So the converbs come in, they're non-finite forms. So what do you need? That we would think would be highly frequent. And I get what in the nominative? To you, nada. Egum sindo nada. Now, this is a head final language, agglutinating of the verbs at the end, so nada is here in the position for a verb. Right? It's a agglutinating language. This is like a lot of suffixes. Nothing's going on nada here. But we see with some speakers, it gets reinterpreted as an Evenki morpheme. We put on the imperfective suffix in the second person singular. And at this point, this becomes a transitive sentence. We have a nominative subject. And what is the accusative? What do you need? So that's really interesting. That looks like grammaticalization. We also can see, I need meat. Hunters and reindeer herders can say this all the time. I get a same calc of this construction. Where's my light? So over there on 9, you can see that. Complete calc, again, nada's in the verbal slot. If you want to put it in the past tense, you use the third person singular of to be. I don't remember if I have an example. And it also gets reinterpreted here. This is really interesting, though. Here it's clearly a verb based on the morphology. We have the imperfective suffix marker. We have the first person singular. So here I'm the nominative subject. Meat is in the accusative indefinite, but the word order is Russian. It's not Evenki. So in the wild, what do you get in the wild? These sentences are all through elicitation. And I only get things where nada is used as an Evenki root in elicitation. So in the wild, when I'm just getting life stories in spontaneous text, I get nada treated with a converb. So here, this is a calc of that construction using native resources. This is an interesting one because it's a little hard to tell what this woman is doing since the first word is the Evenki word and the second is a borrowing from Saha, the Turkic language they're in contact with. The morphology is Evenki. You can see you're getting a first person plural. And then here we have Beechin, the past. So it's a little odd here. What's going on? It's a little bit of a mess. So we might posit a climb here. Is nada borrowed as an individual word and then reinterpreted? Is the construction borrowed and then the construction spreads? There's no evidence that that construction served as a model for other impersonal constructions. As I said, it's not found as an Evenki root in the wild, and there's no use of that native deontic morphology that I showed you. So there's a lot of problems here. We don't have empirical evidence for this. We can look a little bit more at the text. Here we see something that looks like code switching. She says in Russian, it turns out, and then this is a really nice relational noun in the middle. Beautiful use of a converb. But then we have nada было, back to Russian. So I don't know. If we look briefly, I'll move quickly so we can have a few questions. If we look at Edelman, which I told you is highly endangered, and by the time any Edelman was recorded, there was already a serious shift to Russian. There's not monolingual historical text. So Volodin publishes this, and his glosses, which I did not totally change. First, he glosses it, he doesn't mark morpheme boundaries, and he glosses them into Russian, and then I put it into English. So these, ne nada, and then we have this istan. So she does not need these. Notice that the negation is borrowed with nada, which is exactly what my daughter did, for whatever that's worth. And
Here we see, this is also Valurin's data, that the construction is replicated, the dative is replaced by the Edelman additive data, but we still see that it's being borrowed, as is the conjunction, imada. And then if we look at a language that is a little more robustly spoken, Kalmyk, with 80,000 or so speakers, we see that they have basically retained their native morphology, although there's some code mixing. There's supposed to be parentheses around here if this is a code mix or it's just a borrowing, but we see at the end here, nadaja. And this is, it looks pretty emphatic. You have to throw out the frog. This is not from a frog store. They're telling you how to cook. And if you have frogs in the water, you have to throw out the frog before you cook. Nadaja. So that may just be emphasis there. So we don't really know. We do know that nada is borrowed into pidgins. And here we find the infinitive with ni nada, and this sort of corroborates my idea that the Russian bosses use nada ni nada a lot. And a pidgin on the Chinese border that was recorded in the 1850s, skazivai ni nada, you don't have to tell. So the imperative, the verb forms are actually in the pidgins and in Evenki borrowed in the imperative, again thinking that they heard the imperative an awful lot, which is probably true. So we see it in the pidgins. Mordera, we see posila adavai nado budu, with budu's marking the future. So let's just sum up and leave a couple of minutes for questions. At present, I don't think we really have enough data to look at the stages of borrowing. We don't have data to see if there are stages in loss, or are we just getting sort of a rapid turnover, as Carol Myers-Scotton might say. You get to a point and then all of a sudden you're not speaking the language anymore. There's also no reason to assume that shift is happening the same way in all households, because we know that the social dynamics in households vary greatly. It's exposure to language. We do not know if there are linguistic differences between the Rusty speakers and the semi-speakers, so we can't really tell what's going on with this Kalmyk data. Is this, does this represent borrowing? Is this a code mix? I don't know, maybe that's not an interesting question, but then when you get to the Evenki data, that really did look like borrowing and code mixes. So it's, what's the line there? And you know, you don't really want to say, I know it when I see it. So that's a good question. So here are my questions, which I just pasted out. Are there differences between convergence with and without shift? I would think so. Convergence, without shift, both languages might be participating, whereas with shift, really everything's coming from one language. We don't know the impact of all these L2 learners on the structure of L1 when L2 is greater than L1. My questions about population size. My really critical question, and if anyone has a good answer, synchronic differences in the speech of semi-speakers and Rusty speakers, if you don't know what the language looked like when there were fluent speakers. How do you know? That is really... perhaps there's a reactivation difference, and perhaps one could record the speakers before reactivating them and test it that way. If you've worked with endangered language populations, you know they're often fragile. You're working with elderly speakers who don't have the time or the patience or the energy to talk to you. And you also can't really tell what's going on cognitively there too, so with the elderly speakers. So there's aging maybe a factor. So it's really hard to tease these things out. And with something like Edelman, that's a good case. You have 3 fluent speakers. What does that even mean? For the new speakers, how does their speech differ from traditional speech? Is there a difference between new speakers and heritage speakers? Motivation might be the difference. It may just be a research area difference. People looking at things from the psycholinguistic standpoint talk about heritage speakers. People looking at things, working with them, talk about new speakers. And there's really good reasons not to call those people heritage speakers. They don't like it. And they're under enough stress anyways. But does the social status have linguistic consequences? Can they learn it better or not? We are not really assessing the impact of revitalization. There are, Svesna was talking about my new project about the good life. There's lots of data that show, not lots, there's a number of well-controlled studies, in particular in Canada and Australia, showing that people's physical health improves when they have access to their native language. There's lower diabetes rates. Of course you know there's lower suicide rates, but lower diabetes, lower heart rates, lower heart disease rate, lower cholesterol levels. So clear medical diagnostics show an improvement in life with access to language. So revitalization programs are bringing a benefit. Are they creating speakers? Is that how we measure a success in revitalization or not? I don't know if we can ever get at this, but it's really interesting if we're looking at these resuscitated languages to think about what structural transference there is from the L1 of those speakers. It's a really good way to look at emerging languages on the ground. And then I would encourage everyone to study multilingual practices in depth at all levels, and we need better proficiency measures, because even as we look at Campbell and Munzel's definition of speakers versus Zas's, I don't know if they're talking about the same level of proficiency. How proficient do you need to be a strong semi-speaker versus a weak semi-speaker? Anyway, so thank you very much. Thank you again for coming at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning, and I'll be happy for any questions. I should say people were wanting more pictures. People who know you must feel good one. So the woman in the middle here is an Edelman, new speaker. Tatiana De Guy, she's also a dancer. So this is the Edelman walk around dressed the way I am. But she has a PhD from the University of Arizona and will be starting a postdoc in the University of Iowa looking at language, but she's a new speaker. And the other women on the other side are Saka, Turkic. They are a horse people, that's a horse on her head, and they're completely fluent speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Lenore, for all these inspiring questions. We can consider now for a little 3 minutes. Yeah.
So can everybody hear me?
You can do it. Yeah.
So I actually have a comment and then also a kind of question. Well, I'll start with the kind of question. What insights, and I just don't know the field, and we've already had some interaction where some things are shockingly similar and yet we use different terminology, and we're going to have a conversation about terminology. I'll come back to that. What about instances of, say, modern Hebrew, where you have really successful resurrections of languages, and you have biblical Hebrew, you can regress backwards. Is there work that looks at this? I mean, we know that Yiddish has affected the structure of modern Hebrew. We know that Arabic has, because, of the languages that were spoken when there was mass migrations to not then Israel, but now it is the native language of approximately 9 million people. So is there work insights from that?
There's certainly work on modern Hebrew. There's a lot of it. And Hebrew is at once the best case of revitalization and the worst case. It's the best because it took off. It's the worst because nothing else is like it. There's just the social circumstances. There was a liturgical language that was robustly used and known. So there was a lot of political tensions. And as you know, in creating the modern state of Israel, there were discussions, should the language be Yiddish, should the language be Hebrew? There were a lot of political strife there. But it's really different than anything else. And Tatiana De Guy can't ever imagine that. So this, there were enough people who learned biblical Hebrew, who were forced to learn biblical Hebrew. We all probably have friends who had that and did or did not. So So there's data, but I'm not sure that it's directly relevant in terms of all kinds of things like that. So.
Thank you. I'd like to go back to what you said about the need to have assessment tools in order to assess competence in endangered languages and be able to teach the endangered language better. This is something that interests us. I'm working on the revitalization of Cypriot Arabic. And we are currently developing an assessment tool in order to assess the competence of younger speakers and probably the non-competence also of the speakers. We are aware of all these typologies you talked about, rusty speakers and remembers, etc., etc. And although I consider myself to be a sociolinguist, I regret to say that we need a more precise criteria, linguistically speaking, and probably discursively speaking, in order to assess the competence. Because when you learn or you teach, let's say, a normal language, even if you know some words or some sentences, let's say if you want to learn French and you know how to say bonjour, bonsoir, etc., it doesn't matter, you will be in the same group with people who don't know French at all. But in the case of endangered languages, even if you know some words, or even if you have a passive knowledge of the endangered language, this is very important for the situation and the language. But you cannot have the same kind of teaching for those people who have some passive knowledge and for those who don't know at all, because there is an urgency there, and the urgency and also what is required from the community is to get new speakers of the language. So if you have, so if you have, let's say, people who have a passive knowledge of the language, you have to take into consideration this in the development of the assessment tool. And so you have to elicit also degrees of competence that have nothing to do with, let's say, the kind of competence it is assessed in, let's say, the European framework, like A1, A2, etc. Okay, this is my comment. I want you to elaborate on this issue, because as far as I'm concerned, the only, perhaps I missed some part of the bibliography, the only study I have seen that goes in this direction at Turkey is a research that was done in the United States on the Seneca language, where they take into consideration what I said before.
I don't have a good answer to this question. The sum of the work on second language acquisition in the U.S. has developed some tools, and I think this is where the silos and the divisions in our disciplines need to work together. I think it's a problem with endangered language communities. If I look at Evenki, there's a lot of different dialects. So if I'm assessing someone's proficiency and they're making what looks to be a mistake, then I can't tell if it's a mistake or it's from a different dialect. So that's one real problem, that there's variation there. One of the tools that we're developing for the field, but I'm just not sure how it's going to work, is to record things and then have people who the community has assessed as being very competent assess those materials. It all seems somewhat circular, and I feel like this is a really tricky thing because I do think that we need it. We need it for our own research and we need it for building revitalization. On the other hand, in lots of communities you have elders who tell younger people that they're speaking badly, and then that stops it. And it also may be that the person who's the oldest isn't the person who knows the language the best. That's not always mapping. So I think one of the things we really need to do is get a lot of data on that from different language situations and see. But there's some stuff in the second language acquisition, and there have been some tools developed at the University of Hawaii, but they haven't worked for my field situation, so I don't know.
So it's more of a comment, but I have to say, in the same vein that we've been discussing, parallel universes almost, looking at heritage languages, and mostly, across the board, it's looked at from very, very sociolinguistic to really not quantitative sociolinguistic type of approaches to quantitative to cognitive science to whatever. I'm shocked, to be honest with you, when I see things like the Campbell and Hensel, and it's not just about terminology. It's about the basis of the terminology. So even words like nativeness and native speaker, It's now, I'm proud to say, because I think I've contributed to this over the past 15 years, heritage speakers are native speakers of the language in the sense that they are first language.
Ja sam danas.
Not in all cases, they might be
Da.
simultaneous first
Benedikt.
languages. But by definition,
Just
for
okay.
heritage
Da,
language,
da, Dobro.
dominance gets confused with nativeness at the end of the day. Monolingualism taken as a standard of that which is native, but if you're a bilingual and you grew up with both languages, or chronologically, that one first. What's interesting about heritage grammars is precisely that they are native speakers with the levels of variations that they have, right? And so I don't look, it's 89, there's a lot of things from 1989 that are shocking now in 2018, but I think that terminology is incredibly important, not just because we're talking about ethnic minorities usually at the same time, but also in terms of the point of departure that is precise from what we're describing. So words, for example, that clearly, you're just adopting from here. Fluent. What does fluent really mean? Expressive fluidity. Heritage speakers have in spades.
In endangered language communities, they don't though. So I think
Right.
that this is a real departure, and I'm going to interrupt you because especially once people go coffee. But I think that when you have heritage speakers, by and large, the research is done on populations where you have monolingual native proficiency. And so what we're talking about with the Cypriot Greeks, they can't say anything, right? They can't speak in spades. They give up. They switch to the other language, and you might be able to get at what grammar they have in their heads, but that's not what she wants.
Right.
And that's not what I want. We want the grammar that we're reconstructing. And so that's, I think, a critical point of departure. We care less about order of acquisition. We care about a full system, whatever that full system, and that's really hard to get at when you don't know what that full system looks like.
No, I get that, but just for a second, it's the question of how we apply terms even like full. Because full, and I'm just going to be super formal linguistically, full means universally compliant, whatever you take universality to come from, it doesn't have to be domain specificity, and to fulfill the meaning-sound correlation of language, right? Now, I know that you're talking about people who really cannot necessarily do that, but if full is defined on the basis of some type of accepted standard, whatever that is, whether it's prestigious or not, that seems really troubling to me, for lack of a better word.
I think you're letting the time, I kept saying, I took this terminology, it's out there. It's not what's used in the endangered language community currently, but people here know it. So don't get hung up on that. What we're talking about are people who can't say what they want to say. So they might speak Cypriot Greek the way you speak Croatian. And what do we do with that, right? And so it's misleading. Don't get hung up on that. It's just kind of that diagnostic. But people don't even like to talk about semi-speakers too because there is this stigma attached to that term. So
I mean, that also lies the difference that we can talk about,
Yeah.
because that's typically not the case of heritage speakers.
yes.
Although it does also exist, but it's not the default case of heritage speakers.
I think we need to move on to coffee. Thank you so much for this